أكبر الله أكبر.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We're continuing with the monthly series on the months of the Islamic calendar. And last month we spoke about the month of Rabee Al-Akhir, and today inshallah we're going to be speaking about the next month which we are in at this moment in time, which is the month of Rabee Al-Akhir or Rabee Al-Thani. And today is the 6th of Rabee Al-Akhir, and so inshallah we're going to be speaking about this month. We're going to be speaking about the history of this month, virtues, if any, of this month, and also some of the significant events which took place in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir in Islamic history. So Rabee Al-Akhir is the 4th month of the Islamic calendar. It comes after Muharram, Safar and Rabee Al-Awwal. And Rabee Al-Akhir is also known as Rabee Al-Thani. Akhir means last and Thani means second. So it's also called Rabee Al-Thani, the second Rabee, and it's called Rabee Al-Akhir, the last Rabee. The first one is of course called Rabee Al-Awwal, the first Rabee. And so some call it Rabee Al-Thani, some call it Rabee Al-Akhir. And the scholars discuss which one is best. Is there one that is better? And some of the scholars, they say it's better to say Rabee Al-Akhir. Why? They say it's better for a person to say Rabee Al-Awwal and Rabee Al-Akhir and Jumad Al-Ula and Jumad Al-Akhira, as opposed to saying Rabee Al-Thani or Jumad Al-Ukhra, because they say if you were to say Rabee Al-Thani or Jumad Al-Thaniya, then it may suggest to the mind that there's going to be a third Rabee, Rabee Al-Thalith, or a fourth Rabee. So when you say the first Rabee, then you say the last Rabee, that means there's not going to be another Rabee after that. So you say Rabee Al-Awwal and then you say Rabee Al-Akhir. If you say Rabee Al-Awwal and then you say Rabee Al-Thani, it may come to the mind that there might be a third. First Rabee, second Rabee, people might say there's a third Rabee. So they say it's better for a person to say Rabee Al-Akhir or to say Jumad Al-Akhirah. But as we said, the khilaf isn't it's not a big deal. It's not like an issue which our Islamic principles are based upon. So it doesn't really matter if a person says one or the other. Where does the word Rabi' come from? So last month we also spoke briefly about the month of Rabee Al-Awwal, or specifically about where the word Rabi' actually came from. And the scholars, they have different roots or different opinions with regards to the roots of the month of Rabee Al-Awwal. Some of them, they say the month of Rabi' is called Rabi' because of the timing in which this word or this title or name was first given. So the word Rabi' also comes from, or one of the meanings of the word Rabi' is for it to sprout or blossom. And this is why the word Rabi' is also the word used for one of the seasons of the year. So you have the 4 seasons. In Arab culture, Rabi' is one of the 4 seasons of the year. Which season is Rabi'? Spring. So spring, where things start to bloom and blossom, is also called Rabi'. So it may be the case that at one point in time in history amongst the Arabs, the moment that they used to describe this particular month, it just so happened that it was in the season of spring. And so things were blossoming, flowers were blooming, as they say. And so as a result of this, they called the month itself Rabi'. And as we mentioned before, sometimes names would just stick, and so the name just stayed, and it was called Rabi' after that. And the scholars also mention something interesting. They say Rabee Al-Awwal and Rabee Al-Akhir and Ramadan are the only 3 months in the Islamic calendar where grammatically it's permissible to use the word shahr before them. So grammatically, it's permissible for a person to say Shahr Ramadan. It's in the Quran. Shahr Ramadan alladhi unzila fihi al-Quran. And it's also permissible to say Shahr Rabee Al-Awwal and Shahr Rabee Al-Akhir. Grammatically we say, not Islamically of course, but grammatically it's permissible. They say you can say the word Shahr, the word that means month, before these 3 months. The rest of the months, the majority of the scholars of grammar and Arabic, they say it's not permissible grammatically for a person to precede those months with the word Shahr. That's just one of the rules that they have. Again, it's not like a person sinful or anything like this if he says, Shahr Safar or something, Shahr Muharram, nothing like that. But they say, interestingly, that is something which is exclusively for those 3 months, where you can use the word Shahr before it. And there used to be, of course, 2 Rabi's, or there is 2 Rabi's, Rabee Al-Awwal and Rabee Al-Thani, and it's said that in the past, the months of Rabee Al-Awwal and Rabee Al-Thani, they were given a different name. And some say the name that they were given came from a name which meant, the word is Busan or Wabsan. And Wabsan, they say it refers to the glittering or the shining of something, possibly referring to the glittering of the shining of the referring to the blossoming of the plants or something similar to that effect. And so they say that this is a name that's also been used in the past. Also the Arabs, during this time, it's said that they would reap what they had sowed from the battles in the month of Safar. So that's also, they say, the reason why it's called Rabi', because you're benefiting. Just like things are blossoming, they're also benefiting from the blossoming of the battles by taking advantage of everything that they took from the ghanima and from the spoils of war. There's another opinion where it said that the Arabs, they would divide the winter into 2. And they would call it the 2 Rabi'as. The 2 Rabi'as. Rabi'an or Rabi'ain. And one of the Rabi'as was the Rabi' of water, Rabi'ul Ma, and the second was Rabi'un Nabat, the Rabi' of plants and vegetation, meaning one would offer rain and the next would offer vegetation. So again, similar to the term spring, where things start to bloom and things start to blossom. So you have these different meanings that the scholars derive from the word Rabi' with regards to its origins, with regards to where it came from. And in terms of the virtues of this month, there aren't any specific virtues that are mentioned. And Rabee Al-Akhir is a month, there are no specific ayat regarding it, there are no specific hadith. So there aren't any specific virtues related to the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. And if you look at, for example, the months of the Islamic calendar, they all have their own status and their own virtues. Some are more holier, you could say, or more virtuous than others. Some, it's a time where a person is able to increase in his ibadah, and his ibadah will be rewarded with multiple good deeds, as opposed to other months. And so we can see from the months of the Islamic calendar that the months are different in terms of their virtues in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one may ask, why is it the case that some months aren't given any virtues, whereas other months are given many virtues, such as Ramadan is of course the greatest month of the year, the greatest night of the year is in the month of Ramadan. You have of course Dhul Hijjah, the month of Hajj. You have other months also, the month of Shawwal is also a blessed month, the month of Muharram has its virtues. So why is it that some months Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specified in terms of choosing it to be a more blessed month when it comes to good deeds as opposed to other months? And the answer is, this is simply from the decree and the decision and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, as the Messenger of Allah said in the hadith, where he said some parts of the year and some months Allah has blessed over others. Some days Allah has blessed over others. And so it's from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that some days, some months are more blessed over others. And this is actually a benefit for us. It's actually beneficial that we have some days, some moments which are blessed, more virtuous, and some days which aren't as virtuous. Why is it a blessing for us? Well, if we look at it from the other perspective, the other argument is that all of the months are virtuous months. All of the months are blessed months. And one can say if all of the months have the same kind of virtue, if they all have the same kind of virtue, and they're all virtuous the same way, then it's more or less the same as saying none of them are virtuous, in a way. Because if you're saying all of them are virtuous and they're all exactly the same in terms of their virtue and their status, then if they're all the same, then one can say there's no difference then. So either you say none of them are virtuous, but this goes against the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, a person, if he was intending on taking advantage of certain moments, certain days, certain weeks, certain months, to be able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he won't be able to take advantage of them because Allah wouldn't have chosen specific months for him to increase in his ibadah. And so there's that problem. And then if you look at the other side, and you said, again, as we said before, if you said all virtuous months have their virtues, or all the virtues are the same, then it will be just the same as saying that they're not virtuous. And then having every single month full of virtue, it would be at a disadvantage to the believer. Why would it be a disadvantage to the believer? Because even if he did try to increase in his ibadah and increase in his worship, it would end up being too much for him. Because literally he's trying to increase in the ibadah, and also the value of the virtues of those months won't be the same. If the value of every single month was the value of Ramadan, then when Ramadan comes, it wouldn't feel as blessed. You wouldn't have the barakah of Ramadan. You wouldn't feel like there's significance to increasing in one's ibadah in Ramadan. So this is from the mercy of Allah, that He's chosen certain months, certain moments, certain days, certain times of the year to be more virtuous than other times. Certain days better than other days, certain nights better than other nights. And so when a person is in moments like this, when he's in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir, for example, then of course he does ibadah. Because at the same time, one can say every single moment a person's been given is a blessing. And so increasing in ibadah, doing more acts of worship, whenever it may be, wherever it may be, a person should try to increase in his acts of worship. Because inshallah he'll be rewarded. But also, these moments can also be used for a person to recuperate from the ibadah that he possibly did before, or preparation for the ibadah that's going to come in the months that follow. So for example, we know, as we'll mention in the future inshallah, we know that the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't fast more in any other month than when he did in the month of Sha'ban. Why? Because it precedes the month of Ramadan. And so it's preparation. So the Prophet ﷺ would use certain months to prepare for the months that follow. And so moments where maybe there are no virtues, such as this month, Rabee Al-Akhir, it could be used to prepare. It could be used for a person to get into the habit of being consistent when it comes to other acts of worship, so that when those months come, when those moments come where worship is more virtuous and more rewardable, and those days are more blessed, he's already increased in his ibadah. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, أَحَبُّ الْأَعْمَالِ إِلَى اللَّهِ أَدْوَمُهَا وَإِنْ قَلَّتْ. The most beloved acts to Allah are those which are consistent, even if they're small. And so a person should always try to increase in his ibadah, even if it's a small amount. So there are no virtues, but a person should try to increase in his ibadah as much as he can, to take advantage of the blessing of just being able to worship, being able to be in these days with full health and with full ability to be able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're going to be speaking about some of the incidents which took place in this month. And one of the incidents which took place in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And it was in the first year of the Hijrah. And it was regarding the Asr Salah. Now, how did the salawat begin during the time of the Prophet ﷺ? When were the salawat first established? When were the salawat first established? The 5 prayers. Mi'raj. Isra Mi'raj. So during the ascension into the heavens, the Prophet ﷺ, the famous hadith, he met Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah Azza wa Jal gave him 50 salawat. And then he went down and Musa asked him what Allah had given him. He told him 50 salawat. He told him this is too much. Go back and ask Allah to decrease. And he kept going back until it was decreased to 5 salawat. When a person prays 5 salawat, he gets the reward as if he prayed 50 salawat. This was when? This was during the Isra and Mi'raj. And Isra and Mi'raj was towards the end of the Meccan era, before the Prophet ﷺ made the Hijrah. And he made the Hijrah in the 13th year of prophethood. So this was maybe the 11th or 12th year of prophethood, before the Hijrah. 1 or 2 years before the Hijrah. So the question now is, were they praying before the 5 daily prayers? That's the question. Were the companions, were the Muslims, was the Prophet ﷺ praying before the 5 daily prayers? And the answer is yes. They were praying. What were they praying? When were they praying? First of all, we know the hadith where Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet ﷺ, and this is a Meccan hadith, where he came to him and he taught him how to perform wudu. And he told him how to perform the salah. And so the Prophet ﷺ was taught the salah. We know of narrations in the early days of Islam, you're talking like the first few weeks of Islam, maybe even the first few days of Islam, where Ali radiallahu anh, who lived with the Prophet ﷺ, saw the Prophet ﷺ and Khadija radiallahu anha praying. He saw them praying. And so he asked what they were doing. They said, we're praying and we're worshipping Allah, we're not worshipping idols anymore, and I've been chosen as a messenger. And he started giving da'wah to Ali radiallahu anh, and Ali radiallahu anh became Muslim. And they were from the same household, they lived in the same house. And so that's why there's debate with regards to who was the first person after Khadija radiallahu anha to accept Islam. Was it Abu Bakr radiallahu anh? Was it Ali radiallahu anh? Because Ali radiallahu anh was in the house of the Prophet ﷺ. Yes, he was around 10 years old, or 12 years old, but he was in the household of the Prophet ﷺ. Others, they say Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was the first one, because he was the closest friend to the Prophet ﷺ. And your closest friend is somebody you're always in touch with. You know, he's somebody you're always talking to, you're always in contact with, you're always seeing each other, maybe every day you're seeing him, because you're such close friends. That's what best friends are like. You're always together, you always do everything together. And so the scholars, they say Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was the first to accept Islam. And the scholars, again, they reconcile by saying the first woman was Khadija, the first man was Abu Bakr, and the first child was Ali radiallahu anh, and they reconcile in this way. The point being here, Ali radiallahu anh saw the Prophet ﷺ praying, which means he was ordered and he was taught how to pray the salah in the early days. But what salawat would they pray, and what times were those prayers, and how many rak'ahs would they pray? Scholars differed. Some of the scholars, they said they were given, the Muslims were given 2 salawat that they would pray. And this is different to the Prophet ﷺ, by the way. The Prophet ﷺ, what was made obligatory to him when he came to salah was different to what was obligatory to the companions. The Prophet ﷺ, he was told, قُمِ اللَّيْلَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. Pray during the night except for a small amount. And he would pray every single night. It was an obligation upon the Prophet ﷺ to pray the Hajjud prayer, to pray the night prayer, every single night. He never missed a night prayer. That's specifically with the Prophet ﷺ. So, with the companions, what would they pray? It's said that in the Meccan era, before the 5 salawat were made compulsory, the companions were commanded to pray 2 rak'ahs during the day and 2 rak'ahs during the night. That's according to some scholars. Other scholars, they say it was a prayer in the morning and it was a prayer in the late afternoon, without any prayers during the night. And in the night they had their Qiyamul Layl, they had the Tahajjud Salawat, the night prayers. So scholars differ with regards to exactly what times the prayers were, but they were both 2 rak'ahs. It seems to suggest that they were both 2 rak'ah salawat that they would pray. And interestingly, it's said that the Prophet ﷺ after the 5 salawat were made compulsory, it said that even after that, the Prophet ﷺ would still pray 50 salawat in the day and the night. 50 units of prayer. If you add up the compulsory prayers, the rawatib prayers, the sunnah prayers, the nawafil prayers, the witr and the sunnahs before and after the salawat, the duha prayer, for example, the prayers of the night, other salawat, it's said that the Prophet ﷺ would actually pray 50 units of prayer every single day. SubhanAllah. And so the Prophet ﷺ, after he made the hijrah, it said that those who say the Asr prayer, the prayer that was prayed in the late afternoon, which is the Asr prayer, initially it was 2 rakahs. And after the hijrah it was changed. So Salatul Asr was changed from 2 rakahs to 4 rakahs. So Asr now becomes 4 rakahs. When did this happen? This happened the first year of the hijrah in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. The first year of the hijrah in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. And so the scholars, they say this occurred in the first year of the hijrah, and it specifically was in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir, and this is why we're mentioning it here. And of course, Salatul Asr has its own virtues, has its own rewards. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically singles out the middle prayer. Allah says, حافظوا على الصلوات والصلاة الوسطى. Allah says, preserve the salawat, especially the middle salah, which is the Asr prayer. And so again, it shows us the significance of the prayer. Interestingly, this ayah comes after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about marriage and family and divorce. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said in a hadith, whoever wishes to lose his family and to lose his wealth, let him abandon the Asr salah. So again, it's interesting how the Prophet ﷺ and Allah Azza wa Jalla in the Quran used the Asr prayer as something that if a person is strict with and is disciplined in observing the Asr Salah, it's a means for him to increase in his wealth, and it's also a means for him to be having an increase with regards to his family. And so the Asr Salah was changed after the first year of the Hijrah in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir from 2 rakahs to 4 rakahs. The second incident which I wanted to mention that also occurred in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir was in the 9th year of the Hijrah. In the 9th year of the Hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, and it was the expedition to a place called Ta'i. And Ali radiallahu anh, in the 9th year of the Hijrah, was sent by the Prophet ﷺ with around 150 soldiers, all on horseback, to an area called Ta'i. This is just before the death of the Prophet ﷺ, because he passed away roughly a year later. He was in Medina after the Hijrah for 10 years. So, 9th Hijrah, he's sending Ali radiallahu anh with 150 soldiers on horseback to a place called Ta'i. Where is Ta'i? Ta'i is around 1,000 miles north of Medina. So it's way up north of Medina. And why did he send him there? Because Ta'i was a land of shirk. The town, the village was full of mushrikeen. There were no Muslims there. And so Ali radiallahu anh was sent, and the Prophet ﷺ sent Ali radiallahu anh, and when they got there, narrations mention that there was a small battle, a small skirmish took place, and they were easily victorious, and they destroyed the idols. There were some idols there, and it's also said there were 2 swords, specific swords, that they used to hang over the idols, because they would have their own traditions and cultures and virtues that they would have related to the idols and related to the acts of worship and shirk that they would do. And so they would hang the swords over the idols. And they said that Ali radiallahu anh took those 2 idols, and it said in narrations that the 2 idols were called, the two swords were called Mukhdam and Rusub. Those are the names of these swords. And Ali radiallahu anh took those swords back to Medina and gave them to the Prophet ﷺ, and they were used for the sadaqah and the zakat, and it was added to the spoils of war that was distributed amongst the Muslims. And so while they were there, prisoners of war were taken, and some women were taken captive. From them was the sister of an individual by the name of Adi ibn Hatim. And Adi ibn Hatim, he was from Ta'i. He was, you could say, the leader of Ta'i. He was the one who was in charge of Ta'i. When he heard about the Prophet ﷺ coming to Taif, he fled. He ran away. And he was responsible for his sister. His father had passed away. Hatim, his name was Hatim al-Ta'i, based on the place called Taif. So his father was called Hatim al-Ta'i, he's called Adi ibn Hatim. His father passed away, he's responsible for his family, especially for his sister. He's the one who's taking care of her, he's the guardian of the sister. He finds out that they're going to attack, he leaves and abandons his sister. He just escapes. And so they're conquered, she's taken as a captive, and the Prophet ﷺ is honorable towards her, he's generous towards her, and she's freed. And it said that she also accepted Islam, Allah knows best. And what happens? Adi flees to Sham, flees to Persia, to Sham. And then he hears about the Muslims conquering Taif and other areas. And so he starts to make his way back until he meets up with his sister. And his sister, starts scolding him, saying, where were you and what happened? You abandoned me, what kind of man are you? You're supposed to be guarding and be the protector of the family, and you just left me. And then she advises him to go to the Prophet ﷺ. And she says, if he is a prophet, then he'll treat you well. And if he's a king, which you could say he is, if he's not a prophet, one may assume he's a king because of how much was conquered at the time, then he'll be noble and just with you, because he's a noble person, because of course now she's had interactions with the Prophet ﷺ. And so Hatim al-Ta'i, he makes his way and he ends up meeting the Prophet ﷺ. And he mentions the story himself. He says, I was with the Prophet ﷺ and we were walking إِذْ لَقِيَتْهُ إِمْرَأَ ضَعِيفَ كَبِيرًا, when a small old woman stopped him as we were walking. An old, feeble, small woman. And فَاسْتَوْقَفَتْهُ, she stopped him, فَوَقَفَ لَهَا, and he stopped for her. And وَقَفَ لَهَا طَوِيلًا, that he stopped for her for a long period of time. تُكَلِّمُهُ فِي حَاجَتِهَا, and she was speaking about her needs. So they're walking, it's in the city of Medina, and an old, frail, little woman stops the Prophet ﷺ and just starts talking for a long time. And a person might think this woman, maybe she's senile, or she's just talking about all kinds of things. I have other things to do, I've got important affairs to deal with, etc., etc. And of course, Adi ibn Hatim is seeing this, and is recognizing the behavior of the Prophet ﷺ, how he's reacting, how he's behaving towards others. And of course, you can tell he's impressed, because the Prophet ﷺ isn't, ignoring her. He's not just agreeing to everything, or just trying to let her say whatever she wants to say until he can go. You can tell he's actively listening and he's paying attention to what she has to say, to listening to her needs, etc. And so he's watching this, and he says that he stayed with her for a long time and she was talking about her needs. And he said, I said to myself, Wallahi ma hadha bimalik. I said, by Allah, this isn't a king. Would have his guards, he'd have his entourage, he'd be going from here to there, he wouldn't just stop in the middle of the street with no one to protect him and no guards, and have an old woman come to him. And a king wouldn't just stand there and talk to an old woman for half an hour. We don't know exactly how long it was, but you can tell it was a long time, because he's mentioning himself, it was a long time. So it wasn't like a 5-minute conversation. So it's not, a king wouldn't do anything like this. And if they did, it would be like an amazing thing. It would be an admirable thing for a king to talk to somebody for a long period of time who he doesn't know, he's never met, somebody who doesn't have any significance or social standing or any power, a weak old woman, and she's just talking. It shows what kind of person the Messenger of Allah was. And so the fact that he recognizes this, and he says this, obviously it shows us that the Prophet ﷺ would go a long way when it came to his character being a positive influence and a means of da'wah towards others. Simply by the way he would behave, people would accept Islam. And there's so many examples of this, and this is another perfect example of how the Prophet ﷺ would use his akhlaq and his character to positively influence others and to give da'wah essentially. So he says, by Allah, this isn't a king. The way he's acting, this isn't a king. There's something else going on here. This person's something else. So he says, ثُمَّ مَضَى بِي رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. Then the Prophet ﷺ carried on walking with me. إِذْ دَخَلَ بَيْتَهُ. When he entered his house, and he invited me into his house. تَنَاوَلَ وَسَادَ مِنْ أَدَمٍ. So he gave me, he presented to me, on the floor, there was a cushion. There was a pillow or a cushion. And it was the only cushion in the house, in the room. His house was only one room anyway. So there was only one cushion on the floor. And so, Ali ibn Hatim, he says, فَقَالَ لِي اجْلِسْ عَلَى هَذِي. He said, sit on this, sit on the cushion. There's only one cushion. And this is the leader of Medina. This is the king, of the so-called king of the Arabs, as some perceived him. And so he's saying, sit on the cushion. Whereas you would assume that the cushion would be for the host, especially the leader of the Muslims, the leader of the city of Medina, the king of Medina. And again, if you were to compare him to a king, the king has his seat. And I'm sure, some of us, we have our own place where we sit, or parents or our fathers or uncles or other people, they have their own chair, they have their own seat. No one else sits on it. It's just something that's done sometimes. And so he says to Ali ibn Hatim, he says, "Ijlis ala hadi." You sit on this. And so Ali ibn Hatim, he says, "Bal anta fajlis alayha." He says, "No, you should sit on it. It's your house, it's your cushion, like you should be sitting on this." Well, I'm not going to sit on it. I'm not a Muslim. And so he says to him, "Bal anta." He says, "No, rather you should sit on it. Or when you're sitting on it." And so Ali ibn Hatim, he said, "فَجَلَسْتُ." I sat on it. وَجَلَسَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ بِالْأَرْضِ. And the Prophet ﷺ sat on the earth. So he sat next to me, and he was sitting on the earth while I was sitting on the cushion. And so again, he said, I said to myself, "Wallahi ma hada bi amri malik." I said, by Allah, these aren't the ways that a king behaves. These aren't the affairs of a king. The things he's doing, they're not things that a king would do. And so look at the da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ, and of course, as a result of this, Ali ibn Hatim accepts Islam. He actually accepts Islam, and he becomes a famous companion. He was known for his eloquence, he was known for his beautiful speech, and he also participated in the Ridda wars, the wars of the Ridda, where many people left Islam and they followed the false messengers of the time. And so he was somebody who cemented his iman and his position as a companion. There's another interesting hadith about the father of Adi, radiallahu anhu, Hatim al-Ta'i. Hatim al-Ta'i was a man who was known all over Arabia as somebody who was very generous, a very noble man, a very good person. And he was known for his generosity, he was known for his good conduct, his nobility, his kindness, his, good, just a general good person, as there are people nowadays who we think of, who've maybe passed away in the West, people who are not Muslim, but they were known for their good conduct. They were known for doing certain things for civilization, or for their communities, or for the people, or for the world, whatever the case may be. Martin Luther King, or whoever you could think of, Mother Teresa, etc. So Ali ibn Hatim, he one day speaks to the Prophet ﷺ about his father, and so he says to the Prophet ﷺ, "Inna abi kana yasilu rahim," that my father will always keep ties of kinship. وَيَفْعَلْ وَيَفْعَلْ, and he would do this and he would do that. Meaning he was a very good person, he was a very honorable person, a very righteous person. So what is he basically asking?
Can he be forgiven?
Will he be forgiven?
Yeah, his father would get paradise.
Will he be in Jannah? What's going to happen to my father? So, فَهَلْ لَهُ فِي ذَلِكَ, will he have anything as a result of this? Will he be given anything because he was a good person? And the Prophet ﷺ, he says to Ali ibn Hatim, he says something very interesting. He says, "Inna abaka talaba shay'an fa'asabahu." Verily your father wanted something and he was given it. Meaning what? Meaning people who don't believe in Allah and they don't believe in the Akhirah, they do good things for what reason? What's the purpose? There's no intention of pleasing Allah, there's no ikhlas.
So the people can praise him.
So the people can praise him, so that people will say good things about them. so that when they die, they'll be remembered. So that word will spread that this person is a good man, this person is a righteous man, this person's he's one to remember. People will respect him, respect his family, respect where he came from. He'll be loved. People like to be loved. And so this is the goal, this is the aim. إِنَّ أَبَاكَ طَلَبَ شَيْءٍ فَأَصَابَهُ. Your father seeked something and he was given it by Allah. Meaning, he was given popularity, love, honor, respect, people remembering him after he's passed away. This is what he sought and this is what he's given, what he was given. And so it shows us that just because a person's a good person doesn't mean that you're going to enter Jannah, because it's all about your intention. Because if you're not doing it for the sake of Allah, then you're doing it for something else. And if you're doing it for something else, then of course Allah will reward you in the dunya for your other intentions. Which means righteous people, good people who do good things in this world, Allah will reward them in this world, in the dunya, by giving them good, or by having them as people who are remembered. And of course the examples I gave, people remember them, people talk about them, they're studied, in schools, and we learn about them. So they are being remembered, people do talk about them, they are people who people look up to and use as examples, etc. And this is the reward that Allah Azza wa Jalla gives them in this world. As for the Akhirah, they won't have a reward, because they never believed in Allah. They didn't have ikhlas and sincerity when it came to their actions. And then the other issue is, and this is a common question about good, if someone does good, will he be rewarded? One also has to define, what do you mean by good? And how do you define good? Because nowadays, you can live in this country, you can be supporting lots of different causes which go against Islam. No need to mention anything, you guys understand. Lots of causes that are happening in society today where people are supporting certain people of certain orientations, and it's like it's something good, whereas actually it's harmful. Or a person might be supporting certain initiatives, or supporting certain countries, or supporting certain background, people of certain backgrounds, or certain political ideologies. And they'll think it's good, they'll think it's beneficial, but it's actually harmful. It goes contrary to what Islam says. So again, when people say he was a good person, he did good things, well, you have to define what's good. How do you define what's good? Who defines what's good? According to who was he doing good things? Based on whose idea of good conduct and morality and righteousness, isn't it? So again, this idea then goes back to how you define what's good. So it's a beautiful hadith which really shows us, yes, the person will be rewarded in this life. As for the Akhirah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward those who are sincerely doing things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's an interesting story about the conquest and the expedition of Tay and the Islam of Adi ibn Hatim radiallahu anhu. Another incident which occurred, and by the way, this incident was of course in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. This expedition to Tay was in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. The third incident, which was in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir, was the conquest of Jerusalem in 16 Hijri. And may Allah support and protect the Muslims in Palestine. Amen. 16th year of the Hijrah, Umar radiallahu anh conquered Palestine, conquered Jerusalem. And there are narrations which are mentioned about Palestine being conquered by the Muslims, where Umar radiallahu anh, he came, and I mentioned this yesterday, he came and he was in simple clothes. It was just him and a slave, and they were on one horse, as some narrations mention. And Abu Ubaidah Amr ibn Jarrah, who was the conqueror of Palestine, was thinking, everyone's here, it's a great city, it's one of the crown jewels of the Roman Empire, and it's just him, two people coming. It's just, he thought maybe Umar should make a bit more effort, and so he mentions this. He says, maybe you should be like, you should have something, you've come a bit too humbly, you should have come a bit more, with a bit more extravagance, prepared for the occasion, just prepared a bit more for the occasion. And so Umar radiallahu anh, he said, لَوْ يَقُولُ ذَا غَيْرَكَ أَبَا عُبَيْدَةَ. If only somebody else had said this other than you, O Abu Ubaidah. Because of the status of Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anh and his Islam. And then he said, إِنَّا كُنَّا أَذَلَّ قَوْمٍ, that we were of the lowest nations, the most disgraced nations, the most disgraced of people. فَأَعَزَّنَ اللَّهُ بِالْإِسْلَامِ, and Allah gave us honor through Islam. فَمَهْمَا نَطْلُبُ الْعِزَّةِ بِغَيْرِ مَا أَعَزَّنَ اللَّهُ بِهِ. And whatever we do to try to seek honor through anything other than which Allah has given us honor through, أَذَلَّنَ Allah. Allah will disgrace us. Meaning it's because of Islam that Allah gave us honor. Umar radiallahu anh is speaking to Abu Ubaidah as he's going to take the keys of Jerusalem. They've just conquered Jerusalem. So he's saying, Allah gave us honor through Islam. It's because of Islam that we're here in the first place. How did we end up here? It's because of Islam. And he says, if we're now going to find izzah in other things, if we're going to now appeal to other people at the expense, Umar radiallahu anh is saying, at the expense of my deen, I'm going to dress better now for other people as opposed to for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, behave differently, act differently, look differently, just for the sake of the people. He's saying, if we seek izzah and honor through other than whatever Allah has given us honor through, which is Islam, then Allah is going to disgrace us. And it's a beautiful statement by Umar radiallahu anh, which should make us reflect about the efforts we make for the sake of Allah, and how much we truly believe Allah will honor us through Islam, and how much we sacrifice of Islam for the sake of the dunya. When it comes to money, lying for the sake of money, when it comes to buying things which are unnecessary, when it comes to how we spend our time and what we sacrifice our time for, when it comes to the way we speak, when it comes to how we are with our ibadah in public and in private, so many of these things that we are all guilty of. We're not sincere for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't do as much as we actually could. And so then, we think about Islam and the state of the Muslims, and we look at our actions and the state of the people across the Muslim Ummah, and in some ways, we also have to blame ourselves, whereas we're a result of where the Ummah is. And Allah doesn't change the state of the people until they change what's in themselves. So the conquest of Jerusalem took place in the 16th year of the Hijrah, and it was in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. It was in this very month, the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. Finally, the raid on Mecca by Al-Hajjaj, where Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu anh had fortified his position, and this is of course after the death of Umar radiallahu anh and Uthman radiallahu anh and Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, and there was other issues which had taken place, the assassination of Hussein radiallahu anh, the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the son of Ali radiallahu anh, and there was a breaking down of the leadership amongst the Muslims. And Abdullah ibn Zubayr had declared himself to be the leader of Hijaz, Mecca and Medina and the surrounding areas. And Hajjaj had been appointed by the governor to be the one who would fight against Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And as a result of his fortification in Mecca, Ibn Zubayr's fortification in Mecca, he was fortified in the city, and so Hajjaj was using catapults and throwing rocks and stones to try to kill those who were on the side of Abdullah ibn Zubayr and to kill Abdullah ibn Zubayr himself. And eventually those rocks and those stones damaged the Kaaba itself. And so it's said that Abdullah ibn Zubayr, he rebuilt the Kaaba. And when he rebuilt the Kaaba, he rebuilt it how it was before it was rebuilt in the time of the Quraysh, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, where it was actually a cuboid shape, it was rectangular in shape. And he placed the door back onto the ground, because prior to that it was actually raised by Quraysh when it was rebuilt. Before that it was on the lower, it was lowered down. When they rebuilt it in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was higher, it was raised. And now Ibn Zubayr again lowered the door. Why? Because it's a narration of the Prophet ﷺ, where he mentions that if I was worried about how the people would react, I would rebuild the Kaaba how it was before it was built by the Quraysh, or Kama Qala Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So again, there are narrations which mention this, and Ibn Zubayr rebuilt the Kaaba in the manner in which the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned. But then of course, Hajjaj had overtaken the city, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu anhu was eventually killed. He was assassinated and executed by Al-Hajjaj. And this happened in the 73rd year of the Hijrah. The 73rd year of the Hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. And so these are some of the incidents which took place in this month, in the month of Rabee Al-Akhir. And inshallah with this we'll conclude for today. And inshallah we'll continue with this series next month with the next month, Jumad al-Awwal inshallah, or Jumad al-Ula. Any questions before we conclude? Any questions?
Yeah, Shaykh. So, you know Rabee Al-Akhir, does it have any relation with one of Allah's 99 names, Al-Akhir? Because one of Allah's names it means the last. Al-Akhir, I think. Is it similar to the month, the naming of the month?
So, it's said that the scholars, they would have, or the Arabs of the past, they would have two Rabi'as. And they would call one, we mentioned before that some say Rabee Al-Akhir was called Wubsan. It was another name that they had, which had a different meaning. And eventually they just called it Rabee Al-Akhir. The word Akhir means last. And so, the reason why they say the last Rabi is because you have two Rabi'as. So they call the first one Rabee Al-Awwal. Because Al-Awwal is one of Allah's names also. They're both Allah's names. Al-Awwal and Al-Akhir is Allah's names. But they call it Rabee Al-Awwal and Rabee Al-Akhir because there's two. And so you have the first Rabi and the last Rabi. The first Rabi and the second Rabi.
So Awwal means the first.
Awwal means the first.
Okay.
And these are also Allah's names. When it refers to Allah, of course, Allah is Al-Awwal because nothing came before him. And Allah is Al-Akhir because nothing will come after him. He is the first and he is the last. So Al-Awwalu, Wal-Akhiru, Wal-Zahiru, Wal-Batin, as Allah says in the Quran. Any other questions?
So the Hajjaj you mentioned, who assassinated the companion of Rasulullah. So is it,
Sorry?
So the Hajjaj you mentioned, who assassinated the companion of Rasulullah.
Yeah.
So is he Hajjaj ibn Yusuf?
Hajjaj ibn Yusuf.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf.
Shaykh, as you mentioned, the first Muslim from the female was Khadija, yeah?
Yeah.
And from the male was Abu Bakr. So what I would like to know, the Waraka, when the Prophet, first Jibreel Islam came down,
Yeah.
and he went to Khadija, yeah, and Khadija took him to the Waraka ibn Nawfal. So Waraka actually he agreed that he is Namusi.
Yeah. So the scholars, they say when he went to Waraq ibn Nawfal, it was after he became a prophet, but before he became a messenger. Because he had been declared a prophet, Nubbi'a bi'Iqra, meaning he was made a prophet with Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, wa ursila bil muddathir, and he was made a messenger with Ya ayyuhal muddathir, with those ayahs. So he didn't call Waraqa to Islam. So he wasn't calling to Islam. So Waraqa, he is a Muslim.